In today's video, we're going to be talking about 3 places you can't go, but people went there anyway. But before we start, if you're a fan of the strange, dark and mysterious delivered story format, then I would highly suggest you subscribing and liking the video. But with all that being said, let's begin. On Monday, May 23rd, 2005, 37-year-old John Wilson got home from a very long day at work and immediately just collapsed under the sofa. John was an oil pipeline inspector in Houston, Texas, and that day had been extremely hot, and he had been driving around all these different job sites, and he'd be out in the sun, and he never really got a break. And so now that he was home, he was totally exhausted and knew he should probably just go to bed, but he didn't want to go straight back to bed and then get up the next morning and go back to work. He wanted to unwind before calling it a night, and so he decided what he would do to unwind would to be go fishing, something he really loved. John did a lot of freshwater fishing, but tonight he decided he would do some saltwater fishing, and so about 7:30 p.m. that night he grabbed his fishing rod and his tackle box. He threw it in the back of his pickup truck and then hit the road. About an hour and a half later, he had driven all the way south to the very coast of Texas to a beach called Crystal Beach, which is right on the Gulf of Mexico. And instead of parking in one of the parking spaces in the lot, John, like he always did, just drove straight through the gate and onto the actual beach. This beach actually had a reputation for a really hard-packed sand, almost like cement, because so many people like John would drive their vehicles out onto the beach. And so he goes to the gate and he drives straight out towards the water, and although it wasn't completely low tide yet, it was making its way towards low tide, and so there was a lot of beach exposed. And so John drove for quite a while, and then he parked still in the tidal zone, but well away from the water. John probably figured that he would not be there for long enough for it to matter, because high tide was not for several hours. And so John hops out of his truck and he walks out into the actual turf and he begins to fish. It was pretty much the middle of the night. There might have been a couple of fishermen nearby, but that was about it. And for a while John probably enjoyed the peace and quiet. He enjoyed fishing, and then after a while John got really tired. Maybe it was from all the hard work earlier in the day out in the sun that was just finally catching up to him, or maybe it was all that moving around in the turf, getting knocked around by the water, that was making him tired, or maybe it was just both. But either way, John decided he wanted to take a nap before heading home again. So he left the surf zone and he dropped his fishing rod in the back of his truck, and then he crawled underneath his truck to take a nap. The following morning, a man who was out for a walk near Crystal Beach looked out into the water and he saw a truck was half underwater in the turf zone, and so he called the police, and then the police called a tow truck, and then the tow truck driver showed up to the beach. And when he got there, it was still relatively high tide, and so he had to wait until it was low tide enough that he could actually attach the chains and start pulling this truck out of the surf zone. And so finally it was low tide enough. The tow truck driver walked down, and as soon as he was standing next to the partially submerged vehicle, he saw there was a body poking from underneath it, and that body belonged to John Wilson. No one knew for sure what happened to John after he climbed underneath his truck, but the best guess is after he went under, he fell asleep, and he slept for longer than he should have. And in that time frame, even though the sand of this beach had its reputation for being really hard, well, after a couple of hours his truck would have begun to sink in the sand. He would have settled into the sand, and so John, as he's laying there at some point, would have been trapped by the underside of his truck, and then from that point either the truck just continued to settle, ultimately crushing John to death, or it kept him pinned there, but he was still alive. And then the tide came in and eventually drowning him. Either way, John's final moments must have been torture. Sevnica is a gorgeous town right in the heart of Slovenia, situated right along the Sava River, which is one of the longest rivers in Europe. The section of the Sava that flows past Savinica was a popular destination for kayakers and canoeists up till 2008, when a hydroelectric dam was built across it, creating a sort of a dead end for anyone trying to go through. That section of the river, they would have to stop at the dam, get out, walk around, and then pick up the river on the other side, or that would mark the end of their trip. That day in 2008, while this dam was still under construction, the mayor of Savinica, who was in favor of the construction of this dam, he understood that this was kind of a bummer for the people in the town. While the dam itself was going to provide more electricity for the town, it did kind of end an era, and so he decided he would organize a final trip down Sava River past the dam, while they could still go right past it, and he was calling this trip the final descent, and so he went all around town asking people if they wanted to come, and he finally recruited 27 other people to come with him on this final trip. And so a few weeks later, on July 3rd, after all the preparations were made, the mayor and the rest of his crew, they made their way upstream to this loading area where 4 canoes had been set out for them, and the staff people that had actually provided these canoes, they offered the group life jackets, and virtually everyone in the group turned it down. It's unclear why they turned down the life jackets, but one could guess that, the river itself was incredibly calm, and they were not expecting to be on the water for very long, and so they just decided they didn't need one. And so after all 28 people got in their canoes, 7 people per canoe, they pushed off the shore and they began their slow trip down the river. And the mayor had actually hired a photographer to come along with them to document their journey. So as soon as they take off, the photographer is looking around, taking pictures and filming the weather. The weather was beautiful and the water was calm, and everything was just going really well. But about 15 or 20 minutes into their journey, they turned this corner and they got a clear view of the dam, which was about 1,000 feet away from them at the time. Now the dam was not done yet, but it was pretty close to being done, and so the actual structure of the dam, it was built, and so even from 1,000 feet away, it was very obvious to tell that ahead there's these big cement archways where the water falls down over this dam, and the whole group pretty much immediately saw they had a problem. The plan, according to the mayor, had been they would get off to this dam, but on the left side of the dam there was going to be a strip of waterway that had not been blocked off yet, because when this dam was complete it would completely obstruct the river side to side. But because it wasn't actually done yet, the construction crew had told the mayor that, yep, the left side, there's going to be an area where you can basically just casually go right past. You won't go down the dam, it's totally safe. But here this group is on the water looking at the dam, and even from 1,000 feet away it was obvious that there was no side way to get around the dam. You clearly had to go through the dam, or you had to get out and go around the dam. Now the river was moving very slowly, there wasn't a strong current, and so there wasn't any urgent decision that needed to be made about what they were going to do to the group. The group knew that the right choice here is to, go to the side and get out of the canoes and either go around or just end the trip there. But the mayor and the few other people in the other canoes got the idea that, hey, why don't we just go over the dam? I know we're not supposed to, and the construction crew explicitly said, don't go over the dam. It's extremely dangerous, but from the looks of it, it doesn't look that bad, and truthfully, it did not look too bad. This was not some enormous dam with some huge drop-off. It was actually pretty small. Where the water kind of went down this fairly small embankment, it was maybe 10 or 15 feet long, and at the bottom of this embankment was some semi-rough water. But overall, it just looked like it might be kind of fun to go down this dam, like you'd be going down a slide with a canoe. And so the mayor was really keen on doing this. He made it seem like it was going to be fun, it was going to be an adventure. So before long, 3 of the 4 canoes were fully on board with the idea of just going over. The 4th canoe that was not prepared to go over the dam had the photographer in it, and they said, we're just not comfortable with this, but we'll pull up next to the dam and we'll film you guys going over this dam. It'll be really cool. And so after their plans about who was going to do what, the 4 canoes continued down the river, and when they got about 100 or 200 feet away from the entrance to this dam, the 4th canoe with the photographer pulled off on the left side of the river. They got out and the photographer lifted up his camera and he began filming the other 3 canoes as they made their approach into the dam. Now the video from this photographer that was released to the public, it shows the first of these 3 canoes actually going into the dam, and you see these 7 people on this canoe. They're kind of happy and excited looking. They have a nervous anticipation like they're about to go down a roller coaster, and they're making their way into this dark section inside of the dam. They're basically going through the gates of the dam where they're going to go down this embankment, and as they go into the darkness, as you begin to lose sight of them, you see the back end of the canoe suddenly pops up, because now they're going down the actual dam itself. They start to slide down, and then you hear someone in the canoe start to scream, and then it goes silent. And then the video just ends. That canoe, right after it slid down that downslope, it would have reached the waters below, but the canoe would have capsized, throwing everyone on board into the water. And these 7 people, they did not even have a chance to catch their breath before they were sucked under, not only because the water was rough at the bottom of the dam and kind of was churning and pulling them under, but also because this is a hydroelectric dam, and at the bottom of the dam underneath the water, where there were all these big openings to underwater tunnels, and these tunnels function like vacuums. It pulled water down inside and then ran the water past a turbine, causing it to spin, and that would generate the electricity. That's what the dam actually did. And so after the water was pushed past this turbine, it would be jetted out somewhere else downstream. Now, even though this dam was not fully operational yet, these tunnels and the turbines at the bottom of them, they were operational. So as these 7 people are dumped into these incredibly dangerous waters, and they're getting pulled down towards these tunnels, the other 2 canoes, they have no idea what's going on with the first canoe, and so they just continue on, and they go over the dam. The second canoe that went down the dam, they also capsized at the bottom. All 7 occupants were thrown out, and they were sucked down underwater almost immediately. The third canoe that went over the dam, they did not capsize, and so they cleared the dam and kind of paddled away. They began looking around for the other 2 canoes that should have already been down there, and there was nobody out in front of them, and so they turned around thinking maybe they're closer to the dam, and they don't see anyone, but they see one of the canoes is completely flipped over, and the other canoe had been broken apart in the churning waters right at the base of the dam, and they see the wood from this canoe just getting tumbled around, and so the third canoe immediately turns and tries to paddle over to the base of this dam to try to start pulling people out of the water. But when they get over there, there's no one. The 14 people that had been in these 2 canoes, they're ultimately gone. 13 of the 14 people that fell in the water that day would perish, and one of the fatalities would be the mayor. The only person who would survive was actually the mayor's wife, who by some miracle managed to swim out of the grasp of these tunnels under the water and made it to shore. Over the next several days and weeks, police divers were able to eventually find all 13 bodies, one of them which had travelled 25 miles away to Croatia. No information was given about the state of these bodies when they were found, and so we don't know if having been sucked down through these tunnels and forced past these underwater turbines played a role in their death. All the public knows is that all or most of these 13 people were sucked down into the tunnels and then died. Full transparency, this next story was pretty difficult to put together because the details of what actually happened to the victim are just very difficult to find. So I think I've done a very good job of putting this story together, and I'm willing to accept that if the story isn't right or there's some missing pieces, I'm willing to accept that I'm wrong. In 1974, 18-year-old Debbie Stone landed what she would consider to be an amazing summer job. She was hired to work at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. Her specific role was to be a hostess at the brand new attraction called America Sings. Disney had basically converted an old carousel, which is a ride that spins around in a circle. They had converted it into a rotating stage to create 6 distinct stages on this rotating stage, and so on each of the 6 stages were different sets of these robotic animals that played different songs about America. And so the way this would work, if you were in the audience, you would walk into this theater that looked like a single theater with one stage right in front of you, but really what you were looking at is one of these 6 stages, and so the audience would sit down. They'd see one performance on one of the stages, and then the stage would rotate, and so the audience would remain in the theater until all 6 stages had rotated in front of them and played their 2 to 4 minute long act. Debbie's job at America Sings was the beginning of these shows where the audience would watch all 6 acts. She'd go on the stage and she would greet the audience, and then the show would start. It would filter through all 6 of these stages, and then Debbie would get back on stage. She would say goodbye to the group of audience members. It was a simple gig, and Debbie seemed to like it. And so July 9th of that year, which was 9 days after this attraction had opened, and so it was 9 days after Debbie had started a job, Debbie was asked to come in for the evening shift, and so she left her house and she made it out of the attraction at around 10 p.m, which was right at the start of the show. And so she went right inside, she hopped on stage, she greeted the audience, and then she left the stage, and then the show began. And so over the next 30 minutes, all 6 of the stages performed the acts, and then the 6th act was done. Debbie slowly climbed back onto the stage, she said goodbye to the audience, and then that audience was leaving the theatre. She turned around and walked towards the back of the stage she was on. What happens next requires some additional explanation of the 6 stages that made up this attraction. Had a fairly tall back wall, and behind each of these 6 back walls that were kind of in a ring was a center of the actual attraction, and in the center was a circular, fairly tall storage room. This storage room did not rotate, it was stationary. These stages and their respective back walls, so they rotated around the storage room at any point around it. The inside of the back wall was maybe a couple of inches. It was pretty narrow, but it was big enough that the person in theory could get stuck back there. It was a real hazard. However, Disney did not put any specific safeguards in place to prevent their staff from intentionally or unintentionally going into the space. They just told their staff to not go back there and to be careful. So back on July 9th, after Debbie had said goodbye to the audience, and she walks towards the back of the stage she's on, she decides to move from the stage. she's onto the adjoining stage, and when she does that, she either trips or falls, or something happens which causes her to fall into the narrow space between the two back walls of the two stages she was on. And so she falls through the gap and then gets wedged between the outside of the storage room and the back of one of the back walls. She tries to pull herself up and pull herself out of the space, but she realizes she's stuck and she starts to panic and she starts screaming for help. None of the staff hear her, or they don't recognize that this is a real call for help. And this new wave of people that are coming in the new audience, they're all talking loudly. There's music playing. They don't really hear her, and anyone that actually did hear her calling for help, they would later said they thought it was part of the show. And so Debbie is screaming bloody murder. She cannot get out of this narrow gap she's stuck in. These stages start to move because the show is going to start, and because Debbie has nowhere to go. When the stage began to rotate, she forcibly got dragged and twisted and rolled, and her body began to contort and bones started to break. And she was forced to continue moving through this narrow space because the stage was just going to keep going until it's reached its next position. And so finally, after it dragged her all the way to its next position, Debbie didn't die. She was grievously injured. She probably had dozens of broken bones, but she was alive, and she was totally stuck. And she was still screaming with every ounce of energy she had, but once again, the audience could never hear her. They always assumed it was part of the show, and apparently the staff also heard her screams and convinced themselves it was no big deal. And so 2 to 4 minutes later, when the act was complete, the stage began to rotate again, and so Debbie again is rolled and contorted and crushed and dragged and smashed and broken as the stage again rotates to its next position. And surprisingly, she's still not dead. She's screaming out for help. No one is coming to help her, and so the entire show would play out the stage again, until finally at the end of the show, one of the audience members alerted the staff that, hey, you really should go check that screaming out. And at that point, they went for a look and they discovered Debbie, and she was obviously deceased. Disney would pay a small settlement to Debbie's family, and then they would put up a number of safeguards on the American Sings attraction to make sure something like this never happened again. Well, that'll be it for today's video. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, mysterious delivered in story format, I'd highly consider you subscribing. And I also want to give you a special shout out to the people that watch my videos from the start to the end. And also, we are 10 subscribers away from 100 subscribers, so if you could share this video to any one of your friends or family and get them to subscribe, that would be highly appreciated. But yeah, goodbye.